How week 2 changed the fantasy landscape and how we're playing it the rest of the season. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find Stealing Signals, my newsletter, over at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele, and you can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. I don't know why I'm doing this voice. Shawn, week 2 was fun. Week 1, we had 12 unders hit. Week 2, we had 13 overs hit. That's
points. More the way I like it.
Yeah,
that's the way I like
scoring. And I mean, it's interesting. You look at a lot of the data, and I mentioned this on some team high value touch data I was looking at and stealing signals. It feels like a lot of it is inconsistent from week 1 to week 2, where a lot of the teams kind of got pulled back to the middle in some respects. They have like a good game and a bad game, or a bad game and a good game, which happens when you have two pieces of data. It's a fun reminder that you can look a lot into, week 1 too much every year. And then week 2 comes around, you're like, oh, there's these other ways that things can play out. It's also a fun reminder for the things that have been the same for 2 weeks. Week 3 could play out very differently.
We do have 2 weeks though, which is, a lot different than 1. Ben, I hated week 1 and my teams almost went undefeated. I loved week 2 and they almost went winless. That's not usually the way that it works.
Yeah, no, that's not usually how it works. It's funny, it's, building teams a certain way to benefit from, certain chaotic events. Maybe we want weird things to happen. No, but week 2 was higher scoring. Our teams did well. Our teams together, did they all lose?
Well, you and I had some of the only teams that I had that did lose in week 1, and those teams did balance it out a little bit more. Our teams looking...
yeah, they're either 1-1 or 2-0 from what I'm looking at right now.
Yeah, so we're in fine shape. One of the things that I would note, just kind of almost as a throwaway off the top, is that if you have the opportunity to pick up some passing game Dolphins after Bill Belichick's, what I think is going to be a very elite defense. This Patriots team is 0-2. They are a good team. And that may not come through exactly with the strength of schedule that they're working with the fact that you have the Dolphins in this division, you have the Bills in this division. The Jets are a team, Ben, you and I are going to dive into a little bit more. So anytime that you drop to 0-2 and you're facing some other hurdles, I mean, you've got problems. The Patriots have some problems. They've got some things that they need to fix. But they are good, and they're going to stop teams on defense. They faced the Eagles and the Dolphins through 2 weeks, maybe the best 2 offenses in the entire NFL. If you can get a little buy low on Tua, for example, a guy who is both getting rid of the ball instantly and pushing it very deep, and he has Tyreek Hill, he has Jalen Waddle, or occasionally he has Jalen Waddle, that team is going to absolutely light the world on fire this year. That would be a buy low for me, even though it's going to be trickier after you've seen week 1. But I mean, you're not going to have that many chances. This is a chance there. We have a lot of Tua. We're excited about that. That obviously did play into some of the week 1 victories and some of the week 2 losses. What else are we seeing here as we look through our teams? Obviously, we were excited that we put in the huge bids on Puka, and he comes out and he has another massive game to where, now he's making history all the time. We do know that when Cooper Kupp comes back, things will change. Although, again, one of the early lessons here, I think, is that people who were injured during the preseason, which is always tough because you want to take the discounts, or at least I do, you get a lot of reminders of the risk. I mean, one of the things here with the Cincinnati Bengals is that, if their quarterback can't play, I mean, we could be talking about some of the same things with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase that we're currently dealing with Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall. That would be unfortunate after how well Joe Burrow has played down the stretch of the last couple of years. But again, I guess I would say that, don't assume that Cooper Kupp is going to be able to come back healthy. I wouldn't give up on Puka too early. I think it's really hard actually to overvalue him, even knowing what we know, which is that it's just 2 weeks, right? What are some of the other things we're seeing with our teams? What are some things that listeners have been asking you obviously we got the really incredible runs from Breece Hall in week 1. And when you're playing the Dallas Cowboys, when you're in a situation you're getting blown out, I mean, I guess that's one of the risks that we have, is not just that the offense is going to be so bad, but if the Jets are non-competitive, then it doesn't make sense for them to risk a potential like absolute superstar. This isn't just a good player. I mean, we're talking about Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson as being separated from the entire rest of the running back position. One of the things, Ben, that jumped out to me this week, and I hope this comes off mostly as a positive, because it's really cool to see the Giants use Saquon Barkley a little bit more effectively in week 2, get him a lot of fantasy points as they create that comeback. Obviously, really sad thing there. He gets injured at the very end and now will be out for a bit. But at least this current version of Saquon Barkley, and I say current version obviously before the injury that happens in that game, just dramatically different level than what we're getting from Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson right now.
Yeah, I mean, so much great stuff there, Sean. I want to circle back to McDaniel first, which is where you started, and you started with the Dolphins, or Mike McDaniel. Circle back to the Dolphins, I guess. One of the best tweets I saw this week, there was a tweet from PFF Sam, who said Mike McDaniel may be overtaking Kyle Shanahan as the coach who is the furthest ahead of the pack schematically in the league. And then the NFL's Greg Rosenthal quote tweeted that and said, or it's been McDaniel for a while, and he just finally found an interview Shanahan couldn't block, which is pretty interesting. And I think fits really well with how you started this show immediately with, I mean, the Dolphins are the story, and they are. And I mean it. I share those tweets because I want to emphasize that, you know, we've been talking about the coaches from the play callers series since the offseason. We spent a lot of time focused on that, Sean. I'm seeing a lot more discussion of those 4, you know, on the Twitter timeline, and how those 4 offenses have done so well. I saw a list of the quarterbacks with expected points, you know, the EPA stuff, who have the most EPA. People say EPA added, but it's, I mean, the EPA literally means expected points added, if I'm not mistaken. So that's just like ATM machine, a little bit redundant. But the top 3, or I mean, the top 4, I think, are the 4 quarterbacks from that series. So it's, I think Jordan Love is 4th, maybe. I know Purdy and Stafford and Tua are right up there. They're leading the league right now in expected points added, and which is more of a real world stat. But very cool that's something, obviously, Sean, we spent a lot of time on the show talking about this offseason. Thought those were incredible podcasts. Told everyone to go listen to them and think about those coaches and what they're doing. But even within that, as we continue to talk about that, we talked about it after week 1 too. It seems like Mike McDaniel is maybe the cream of the crop that we're not really, you know, I mean, and it's interesting. Sean McVay is the other one who has done a lot with a little in Los Angeles. They all worked under Kyle Shanahan initially. Shanahan is the oldest sort of the group, or maybe, I don't know actually if he's the oldest. I know McDaniel is actually a little bit older too, but he's the one that had been ingrained in the NFL the earliest and the longest, and was the OC, and they were all under him when they were all together in Washington. Obviously, Shanahan's dad, Mike Shanahan, was the head coach of Washington at that time. Mike McDaniel leaves the NFL for a bit, winds up under Kyle Shanahan again in some offensive coordinator jobs. I want to say when Kyle Shanahan was in Cleveland is when he became back on the staff. Maybe it's when he was in Atlanta. I'm not entirely sure. And then he winds up obviously on a staff in San Francisco. And then this comment from Greg Rosenthal about the blocking, like there's some rules where the head coaches can block interviews and things like that. But McDaniel finally gets his own opportunity, becomes a head coach. And even within this group, the things that McDaniel has done have been really, really fascinating. I think they're all doing little variations, slightly different things, different variations. They have their own feels and their own ways of doing things. But we've talked a lot about the deep middle completions last year, where like that's an area you want to attack. And you had Tyreek and Waddle and Gesicki all among the top 4 in the NFL in raw receptions in that quadrant or space on the field. He was able to get his receivers, no matter who they were, into this space. And then this year we're seeing the same thing. It's like Tyreek. I mean, there's other teams where people are able to stop top receivers at times. They're able to double them. They're able to do things. Tyreek Hill is an elite athlete, and that his own skill helps. But McDaniel is able to scheme touches for whoever he wants, however he wants, whenever he wants. You talked about the Patriots defense being very strong, and yet they went into some, they were breaking it down on the game about how all of these offenses are built on the outside zone. We've talked about the wide 9 defense and stopping the explosive plays in the outside zone. They get Raheem Mostert loose on some inside zone runs, which was interesting as well, or at least they were breaking that down on a film. I don't know. I hadn't really heard the term inside zone before. I hear a lot of other terms when talking about inside running. So I don't know the inside running game. I don't know, if that's accurate or not, or how to break it down. But they were able to get Raheem Mostert loose for a long touchdown run, and he looks fantastic as well on an inside carry. So they're doing some unique things there as well. But like McDaniel is very good at what he does. And so it's interesting to kind of think through that. And I like the way that Greg put it. I like that you emphasize that Miami is a team to really have your eye on. Maybe we should just be talking about Mike McDaniel in his own class. You also talked about Puka. I couldn't agree more with that.
Well, Ben, really quickly here, you mentioned Atlanta, and when we're thinking about what a quarterback who maybe has some limitations can still do and where they hope to go with this, 2016, Matt Ryan throws 534 passes, which is not an extreme number, and yet throws for 4,944 yards, 38-7 touchdown interception ratio, leads the NFL in touchdown percentage, leads the NFL in yards per attempt, not surprisingly leads the NFL in adjusted yards per attempt at over 10.
Wins the MVP, and I saw today that the current favorite in the betting markets for the MVP is Tua Tagovailoa right now. He has moved all the way up to where he is slightly ahead of Patrick Mahomes in the MVP markets.
And part of that is that drafters, or I should say voters, are going to be looking for someone else that they can give it to. And if you look at the last year and a couple of games when Tua is healthy, I mean, he would be the guy who would be competitive for that. And again, when you have, one of the things that just jumped out about this game is that Mac Jones played extremely well. And yet, throws with anticipation, gets the ball down the field, is able to get out on the edges and either run or throw. And yet, because of the vast difference in the quality of the weapons, anything that he does in the passing game is going to be mitigated by the ability of his guys both getting open and then after the catch. And anything that the Dolphins do, and they're going to do a lot, right? If you were to switch these coaches and quarterbacks, you would get a lot out of Tua and Mike McDaniel either way. But when the person catching the ball at the other end of that is a Tyreek Hill or a Jalen Waddle, it's going to amplify everything that they do. Again, I just very strongly believe that we are into an environment where the explosive ability of your skill position guys, the players who are going to have the ball in their hands, makes a huge difference.
Determines everything.
I mean, yeah. I'm really excited to see where the Dolphins go.
You've been talking about this a lot. And because we kind of discussed it a little bit before the show. I had sent you something the other day that kind of hits on this, which was a really cool thing from Kevin Clark's new show over at ESPN, where he had Channing Crowder on, former linebacker for the Dolphins, and they're talking through a really funny moment in the Tom Brady, Randy Moss era, and how, from Channing's perspective on defense as the defensive signal caller, calling out some things, seeing some moments where they tipped their hands defensively that they were in man coverage, and he sees Tom Brady smile at one point and just, okay, well, and then they could just throw it up to Randy Moss in triple coverage and he wins. And I sent this to you and we had a laugh about it before the show, but what you're referencing even now, and the reason I sent it to you is, and you've talked about this on the show a ton of times, is how these elite talents, the Randy Moss example, like if you just have Randy Moss in your offense, your scheme's going to look good. Things are going to work, right? Like your quarterback can smile when he just realizes before the snap that he's about to get a 50-yard completion because he's got man coverage on Randy Moss.
As Channing Crowder told the story, every time he kind of worked through the anecdote, Randy Moss got taller, had longer arms, and could jump higher.
He's got a 90-inch vertical. Yeah, I mean, it was really great. He's like, what do you even do? And I mean, You've been saying this for a long time. I like to really emphasize the coaches and the scheme and stuff, but this is a hugely important part of it. It's a hugely important part of, why Arthur Smith's team is successful again, is that Bijan Robinson already looks like at least one of the top 3 running backs in the NFL from a skill perspective. I mean, it's like we have Saquon banged up. We now have Nick Chubb, unfortunately, out, which was a horrible thing to see, obviously. I was looking back at some of the rush yard over expected metric over at NFL's Next Gen Stats. Every year they have data on that. Going back to 2018, he's been top 3 in total rush yards over expected. Top 2 in every year except 1.
Well, right before he gets hurt they're talking about how he compares, I believe, to Jim Brown and Jamal Charles.
Yeah.
And
that's right. They're talking about his yards per carry over his career, and he's right there with those guys. Yeah, I remember seeing that.
It just this whole thing has been it's just so rough because like one carry before he got hurt, he had made a beautiful run, and I was thinking, I'm probably going to lose on having faded him just slightly because he's extraordinary and he never gets hurt. And just like one play later, he gets hurt, and it just, I don't know. You always, intellectually that these guys are going to get hurt. And then we had this training camp time period where so many of the players that we love got hurt in a variety of ways. And in some way you're kind of telling yourself, well, maybe it won't be as bad when we get into the season, or, it'll be a little bit later. I mean, you think about, Derrick Henry, when he finally got hurt a couple of years ago after he seemed invulnerable, at least it was halfway through. To lose some of the NFL's best talents right at the beginning of the season.
Right.
I mean, it's inevitable in some ways, but just, I hate it.
That's the point I was trying to make about Chubb, is just every year now. It's easy to take for granted. I don't even necessarily think we have, Sean. I mean, we talk about how good Chubb is all the time, even as we're not huge drafters of Nick Chubb from a profile perspective for fantasy, but as a pure runner, we're constantly saying he's probably the best in the NFL. 5 years straight, top 3 in the NFL, in adding to his situation. I was just gonna, I was talking very positively about Bijan. I was gonna say that I think only probably Christian McCaffrey right now has a case as a better running back right today. And I don't even know if that's true. That's how good Bijan Robinson has looked through a couple of games. But Nick Chubb is another great example of the type of player that makes an entire scheme work, because they wanted to be very run heavy over the years. And it's one of the reasons why with Jerome Ford, there were some really big bids on him where he was available. I know most of the high stakes stuff, he's not available, but in some of the leagues where people are playing in shallower home leagues and things like that, he's available. And there's a lot of recommendations to bid 80%, 100%, empty your clip on this player. You do have to think through, to a certain degree, what happens to the whole offense when you don't have Nick Chubb anymore? And so this is sort of the point we're making broadly, how the elite talents elevate everything. It looks like Jerome Ford's going to be the lead. He's going to be the star number 1 running back going forward. They did bring in Kareem Hunt, but Ford is, I think, going to get the first crack and all those things. But Deshaun Watson hasn't looked good. They lose Jack Conklin in week 1. He's looked really bad. They lose Jack Conklin in week 1, which was a low-key concern, I think, for Chubb and for everyone in the offense, to lose such a good offensive tackle right away. Tore his ACL in week 1. This offense didn't – they lose Conklin and Chubb in the first 2 games, and Deshaun Watson looks bad. I'm a little bit concerned about the whole offense. Jerome Ford.
I think when you adjust for the difference in the quality of the coaching, you could make the case that Deshaun Watson looks even worse than Russell Wilson looked last year. Because, so much of last year was just so flagrantly Nathaniel Hackett. Even though Sean Payton actually has had lots of... it's kind of funny that he would go after Hackett like so aggressively when that's not done. And then they're having a lot of the same problems with him that they had. So maybe there's a little bit of vindication for Hackett there. But Deshaun Watson in the rain spent game 1 throwing every ball at his receiver's feet. In week 2, he's committing these horrible turnovers and continuing to throw wildly to everybody. And Elijah Moore has seemingly gotten open at will. And yet you wonder both about his ability to actually run the routes precisely enough, because he's both open, and yet now this is the second year in a row where even when he's open, his quarterbacks have not remotely thrown the ball to where he actually is. But I mean, otherwise, Deshaun Watson has also looked terrible. I mean, the crazy thing here is that, and the reason that Ford is so expensive is that when Chubb goes out of this game, then Ford creates several highlight plays. And Ford was one of the guys I was actually drafting a lot in the final month of draft season. And I usually put those guys on the 0 RB candidates countdown. In this situation, the argument for him was basically that Nick Chubb is probably not going to take all of the work, because they want this to be a situation a little bit maybe like what we're going to have with the Chargers, where they want the number 2 to actually be very involved and to have some standalone value.
Like they had there with Kareem Hunt in years past, but a lesser version of Hunt probably.
Right. But then the other part of it being that they seem to absolutely love him. And it's always kind of the situation where you hope the team that has a player is above maybe what the market would be. You get to practice with these guys. You get to see what they can do. It does really sour you on some players. I mean, obviously the Chargers seem very low on Isaiah Spiller, for example. Obviously the Rams were extremely low on Cam Akers, and we're just like, we're going to get rid of you. But you do have these cases where the team picked a guy and they like the guy, and they have both more information and they have a lot more control over it than you do have as a fantasy manager, where you're saying, well, this is the evidence. This is the quality that the guy is. This is what the workload projects as. I like it in this situation, but you then don't get to control what they do on Sundays. And, some of the coaches really like to drive home the fact that you have no control over what they do on Sundays, either from deciding or even from guessing.
Shout out Arthur Smith.
But I mean, he looked really good on these plays after Nick Chubb departs. And that is meaningful when you know already that they liked him. And when one of the things here is that is Kareem Hunt or Pierre Strong are actually going to take quite a bit of the volume, and the offense is going to be bad. And so from that perspective, I think you have to be lower on Jerome Ford now than where you would have been preseason if you had been told that Chubb was going to go out.
Right. Because preseason, there's still the potential that the offense, the passing game, everything was working in a way that it's clearly not.
And they could turn that around, right? I mean, one of the things that we have here is, Watson still has the mobility. That's the thing he's really demonstrated. And anytime you can create that much time for yourself, then you have so much that you can do.
So a really interesting thing on that, I wrote in the offseason stealing signals, in his small 2022 sample, his scramble rate was way down. His sack rate was way up from his previous career. If you go digging into the numbers, and I wrote that I was maybe reading, I was trying to give a little optimism for the people that were really in on the Browns. I was reading as a sign, maybe he wasn't really comfortable in the pocket yet, come back from a long layoff. He's trying to extend plays, but he's ending up getting sacked. His internal clock isn't really working.
He was he was extraordinarily bad last year.
Yeah, but that seems to have carried over, right, in weeks 1 and 2. It's not something that, after a long off season, they've figured out, like, hey, we need to work with you on, having the internal clock and getting rid of the ball and those things. 2 really costly, he throws a pick 6 early into some traffic. One of the fumbles was on a 4th down where he was kind of scrambling. The other fumble was the really costly one, obviously, at the end of the game, where he gets strip sacked, and it ends up being the decider for this game on Monday night.
So I think we're going to have that from a reality perspective from these quarterbacks. You're going to have that from him. You're going to have that from a Justin Fields. Justin Fields, another handful of just, tragic plays. From a fantasy perspective, though, we are going to get some value back for the scrambling quarterbacks, to where it's sort of a double-edged sword, both good elements and bad elements. Certainly good elements for fantasy, bad elements for reality that maybe are still a silver lining. Even though the quarterback is playing poorly, they will have the ability to make some plays, whereas Zach Wilson, no ability to make plays. So you have that difference between the bad quarterbacks who completely destroy everything and the bad quarterbacks where, you might still get some big games from individual players within their team.
Yeah, and I mentioned the scramble rates down. They're doing some design run stuff with Watson too. So yeah, there's going to be some things that work out. But With Ford, the big bids that have been there, again, I mean, we're going back to this conversation of how the elite talents actually manifest. And Nick Chubb is Nick Chubb. And you just talked through how they're going to use some of the other guys. They really like Ford. Ford's going to be the lead. No one's denying that. But one of the kind of scary thoughts in my head, and I have Ford in a lot of places too. You mentioned Shawn having him. I have him in, some home leagues. We have him stashed in some of the high stakes stuff, like certainly a late round running back that we were drafting. One of the concerns in the back of my head when I was responding to subscribers asking me how much to bet on him, the sort of scary thought, if you will, is how is this going to wind up being unless he's really good and can elevate? And he's not going to be Nick Chubb good. We already know that because no one is. But he could be good and he could elevate, and that could be positive. And they have a good scheme, I think, running. They've had guys like D'Ernest Johnson, show out and look good. And so there's some things working in his favor. And he has some positive stuff from college and et cetera. I'm not saying he's not going to be good. But unless
well above average head coach.
Yes, you have the coaching. But unless he's really good, if he's more just in the mediocre range, then this offense isn't great. You're probably just talking about, like, how is it different than the dead zone backs, right? Like the Alexander Madison and like Najee Harris, even, and whatever, James Conner, what these guys, Rashad White, where it's like, okay, yeah, you're getting a lot of work, but like, do we really love those ceilings? Like when I'm looking at that, and to your point, going back to preseason, where we would have been on Ford had we known Chubb was going to be out, I would have been higher on his potential because the offense could be better, right? And then he could sort of be brought along by the offense a little bit. He doesn't need to be great necessarily, but you look around that offense right now, there aren't other great players in that offense. So the idea would be maybe Deshaun Watson is a great quarterback again, which he has been in the past. And that's elevating enough that the defenses have to key on how are we stopping Deshaun Watson's multiple skill set. And then the running back is just excelling because of being in, the running back in that type of offense. It lowers the bar for what he has to be as a player. That's not what we've seen through 2 games. And now the outcome going forward is a little bit more concerning. It's a little bit more in that, the dead zone backs who have the strong roles. I mean, I think the point everyone wanted to make, I saw a lot of tweets. They have to enter your clip and this and that. We talk about it all the time. You still need talent. You still need to be able to be efficient to hit real ceilings. He can be and look, if you're getting him off waivers and he's a volume-based RB2 for the rest of the year, that can be really helpful to a fantasy team as well.
And I think that he's more valuable than Justice Hill, but probably not as much more valuable as it might seem. You talk about the different scenarios. I mean, there are scenarios where the Patriots don't decide to give away Pierre Strong to them right before the season starts. There are scenarios where Kareem Hunt actually signs someone else, so a player who is familiar with that team isn't available. Now, I mean, there may be elements where actually Pierre Strong is not good at all, or the Kareem Hunt is completely done. In either of those cases, Ford could really consolidate the work beyond what even Nick Chubb was going to do in that offense, where he was going to lose some to Ford. Maybe Ford doesn't lose work to those other 2 guys if you assume the worst about them, which is certainly within the range of outcomes for those 2 players. But I mean, there are a lot of flags. It could also go kind of either direction still in terms of what the team's identity becomes. One of the things they really wanted to do this year was to put Watson in a situation where he felt a lot more comfortable than what they had asked him to do last year. You go more spread, you throw the ball more, and the team flourishes, and everybody's happy with that. Well, that hasn't worked through a couple of weeks. It's not impossible that it could get better and maybe even be well above average. I don't think that's super likely because now we've got quite a bit of evidence that Watson is struggling in a variety of ways. But it's still possible. If that were to be the case, then Jerome Ford does not anchor in the type of workload that a Nick Chubb would, to where the coach goes in the game and doesn't just forget about the running game entirely and call almost all passing plays. Again, that's not necessarily how you script it, but once things really start to snowball and everything's happening so fast for the coach, if passing plays are working, they're going to lean on those passing plays. The flip side of it is there's still a possibility that Watson plays so poorly that now they end up not going back to exactly the same formations and play calls that they had in the past, but they do end up being very run heavy. And so, I mean, perhaps Jerome Ford does get a very big workload. So this is
But the
an interesting
workload
conversation.
Yeah, the efficiency and everything becomes a concern there. I mean, I think my immediate thought was this offense now has to be Deshaun Watson. I mean, they talked all offseason about focusing a little bit more on Deshaun Watson's skill set, being a little bit more shotgun spread heavy, etc. And I was thinking, well, how does that work with Nick Chubb? A lot. And we were talking about it in the fantasy community. How are the Browns going to work? Well, now that Nick Chubb is out of the equation, I think you have to really lean into that, and you have to start doing shotgun spread stuff and try to emphasize Watson's skill set. And maybe he starts to get that eternal clock back, and the sack rate comes back down a little bit, and the scramble rates maybe up a little bit. He's able to learn when he needs to break the pocket, and all those things allow him to play better overall. Maybe all that happens, but I think the immediate response has to be that they're going to be a little bit more pass heavy. They're going to be a little bit more focused on Deshaun Watson, run the offense through him. And then the other thing that I think has been emphasized, I keep seeing this word league winner thrown around on Jerome Ford. And I don't want to say that's impossible, but I do really enjoy this conversation, Sean, because I think we're kind of hitting on that there's some skepticism for valid reasons. The other issue is, yes, they talked big about him all offseason. One of the things that I was having a hard time reconcile with that was last year they had him active for 13 games because he plays on special teams, and he got like 12 touches on offense. If they loved him that much, wouldn't they have given him some more work at times last offseason? And so I had a hard time with that. Maybe that shifted in this offseason, but there's another interpretation of all of the positive things they were saying, which was sort of feeding it to their fan base for why they didn't bring in another back, why they let Kareem Hunt go and didn't bring him back, right? And we're very high on Jerome Ford behind Nick Chubb, and this is the future of our running back room. And then does that all get thrown out of the window when Chubb actually goes down, and now the rubber's at the road, and you have to actually be so high on Ford that you have to use him? And granted, he's got 31 carries through 2 games. He's got more carries than Najee Harris and Alexander Madison and a lot of those guys, and Ford hasn't started either of those games, right? And so they've shown so far in these first 2 games that they do really like him. I'm not questioning to that extent, but I do think there's at least a little bit of skepticism in terms of their offseason actions being evidence that now going forward, as we're saying, that I think there's people that are thinking he's going to get all of the work, and they're using that league winner term and all of that stuff. And we're talking about how maybe not, maybe there will be some other running backs being used. Sean, the other league winner that you mentioned
to throw in there is, I have a lot of Jerome Ford. I don't have hardly any Kyron Williams, and that will just prejudice you mentally to think, okay, the person I was on is probably the better play. I definitely don't think that's the case. I mean, Kyron Williams is a much better play going forward than Jerome Ford.
Yeah, situation is fantastic for him. And I was going to go back to the Rams because you also mentioned Puka in the intro and the trade value. I wrote about that a little bit in Stealing Signals this week, and you were talking about what's going to happen when Kupp comes back on some of those things. And there's a lot of range of outcomes. I think it's so funny because with Puka, people are concerned about his value because Kupp is knocking down the door. But then when you talk to people who have Kupp or have been high on Kupp or are thinking about Kupp's range of outcomes, there's a lot of skepticism there, right? No one's saying, I'm highly confident that Cooper Kupp's going to come back in week 5 and get all the targets for the rest of the year and be a superstar. And so the two things don't really line up, right? The concern on the Puka side where Kupp's looming and the confidence in Kupp's actual health don't line up. So you do have, you mentioned that, and I just wanted to reiterate that. I think that's a great point, that we do still have some consternation about how healthy Kupp's going to be the rest of the year, what he can do, etc. Now, obviously, any games that he's in and playing and is healthy, Nakua's not going to be hitting 15 targets, frequently with regularity. But I do think we've seen enough from him that he's going to be very involved. He's going to probably be the most reliable teammate that Kupp's had since Robert Woods in the passing game. But the idea of where we go with Puka Nacua value-wise, whether we sell high, you kind of hit on this. I just wanted to point out that we talked about this in the offseason, Sean. You really liked a subtitle that I had for one of my articles where I said you're looking for outliers. And Puka Nacua already is an outlier. He's already shown that. Even if he doesn't do anything else, his first 2 weeks will have shown outlier production. The guy has 35 targets. He's blowing away the NFL in target volume. as a day 3 rookie out of the gate. It's outlier. It's the outlier of outliers in some respects, right? It's crazy. We are looking for those. And so I've had a lot of questions about selling high on Puka Nacua. At what point, what would you want for him? And I emphasize in Stealing Signals that I more or less wouldn't sell him at this point. If you sell guys like this that are already showing outlier ceilings, you will realize small wins in certain instances, but you'll also guarantee that you never get the impact of the huge hits that do manifest sometimes. And the example that I would give is going back to Odell Beckham's rookie season. And I got to go way back to a home league that I was in. But when he misses the first 4 games of the year, he comes back and he has, I know, a 2-touchdown game, another TD. He has something like 4 touchdowns in his first 3 games after he comes back. His first 3 games of his career. I say comes back because he missed the first 4 games of his rookie season. So he goes 4 for 44 and a touchdown in his first game back, 2 for 28 in his second, and then 4 for 34 and 2 touchdowns in his third game. So through 3 games back, he had scored 3 touchdowns. I know that I added him off waivers in this home league, back then. This is a decade ago, obviously. And I wasn't that sold on him, but he had the draft capital and all these things. This is before I was even doing any fantasy content or anything, but I was certainly paying attention to things like, opportunity and efficiency and regression. And that was the way that you thought about fantasy then. Obviously, a lot of my content today pushes back against a lot of that stuff. But at that time, I was like, this guy has 3 touchdowns in 3 games, not seeing a ton of target volume. There's some concerns. I want to trade him. I tried to trade him. I couldn't get anyone to trade for him. Literally, I was trying to trade him pretty low. Couldn't get anything. They had a bye the following week. And so I had 2 weeks to try to trade this guy. Couldn't get anything for him in my league. Comes back the very next week after the bye, 11 targets, 8 catches, 156 yards. You guys know the rest. He goes on to have the best rookie season of all time, essentially. He is an outlier. The point isn't that when I was trying to trade him, he was already an outlier like Nacua. But the lesson that I learned is I almost sold because of some early production. I just wanted to get a sell high on a player that wound up leading me to the fantasy championship. He had 3 touchdowns in the semifinals. I beat my brother. We still talk about it because he had the best team that year by far. But I had Odell Beckham, and he was beating me in the morning games, and Beckham played in the late window and goes for 150 and 3 touchdowns. I come from behind and beat him. And then Beckham goes on and has another 250 yards and 2 touchdowns in the championship. One of my favorite, all-time fantasy stories. It's, it was the most important league to me, bar none at that time in my life. The point is, those are the league winners. That's those are they win leagues, right? That's literally a story of a player winning a league for you. When your team wasn't even as good, and you're looking for those outliers. And it's just an example of what we've talked about since the offseason, Sean. And then when that starts to manifest, I understand the urge of trying to sell high. I just want to drive home the point on Puka Nacua that yes, Cooper Kupp's looming. Yes, there's a lot of ways that he can continue to be a massive hit for the rest of the season that include Kupp not being fully healthy, but also include him being more of a 1B to Kupp than Kupp has had, right? Because Kupp maybe with his hamstring, maybe he comes back and he's only running routes on 65% of dropbacks or something. Maybe they do some crazy stuff and they're careful with Kupp, or I don't know what's going to happen. That would be kind of weird because they have been very heavy with their personnel over the last couple of years. Through 2 games so far, their main 4 guys and 11 personnel have run at least 80% of the routes in each game. So I am kind of expecting when Kupp comes back and plays that he's going to be in the 80% route rate, or higher as well. But there is uncertainty with Puka Nacua is the point. And if you trade for wins, even if you get, a second round value, which you would have to be probably buying low on somebody, you have a guy in Nacua who is hitting right now, who is in a situation where you don't need a turnaround. If you go sell high on him for a buy low that you need to then see turn around and start to hit, that's a mistake. I mean, that is you capping the potential benefit from the hit that you've already realized on Puka Nacua. So I just want to issue that warning. I mean, we've talked about this, I know, before in the past, Sean, but when we have guys that are showing outlier tendencies, I'm so hesitant to trade them under any circumstances.
Well, I want to segue that into sort of our final big segment today. But first, I want to mention, you mentioned Beckham, the player who just has jumped out to me as being so clear-cut, the comparison over the first couple weeks is Anquan Bolden. And he's someone who came out and just had an extraordinary 2003 season. I know for some of our listeners that doesn't like ring in the memory the same way because of how young you may have been at the time. But comes out 10 catches, 217 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Really just out of nowhere. He was not the first receiver they drafted that year. They drafted a different player in the first round, right? And as you go into the year, you're kind of expecting that first round pick to be, no, not to do anything like that, but to be ahead of Anquan Bolden maybe in the pecking order. He does that. And then it's kind of interesting, I think, because he goes 7 straight games without a 100-yard game. He goes 6 straight games without a touchdown. And so maybe you're thinking to yourself, okay, there would have been some reason to move him. Now, in that stretch, he does have a 13-target game, a 10-target game, 2 9-target games. He's not disappeared from the offense. In the second half of the season, he ends up scoring 7 more touchdowns. He has 4 more 100-yard games. And then as his career develops, and these might be things that people are a little bit more on top of, but they draft Larry Fitzgerald in on top of him. And Larry Fitzgerald, obviously one of the all-time greats, and yet his second season wiped out to a large extent by injury. He comes back in year 3 and goes for 1,400 plus yards. Right? If you moved him after a couple of weeks, you miss out on the rest of that rookie season. If you're thinking about it from a dynasty perspective, you miss out on this 1,400-yard campaign later. He has multiple 1,000-yard seasons. Other than that, he did have some trouble staying healthy from that point on. He was the victim of some of these brutal hits that we've kind of mentioned as not really being big fans of. But Puka, we actually have a second game where he's come back and done similar types of things. We know that that's not sustainable production. And yet some of the things you're likely to see from him later in the season are pretty exciting. Ben, I have moved him up to wide receiver 17 in my dynasty rankings. The 2 guys immediately ahead of him are Drake London and George Pickens. The 2 guys immediately ahead of that are Jordan Addison and Brandon Ayuk. The 4 guys immediately after Puka are Zay Flowers, Christian Watson, Deebo Samuel, and Jerry Jeudy. So that's pretty aggressive.
That does a pretty good job of explaining how you feel about him.
And again, this is not somebody that I necessarily expected to do that. You've got to come off of some of your previous expectations when you're moving him there. Think about it from a redraft perspective. That was what you were kind of describing for the listeners there. And I know we get a lot of redraft questions with it. The other person or people that you're getting a lot of questions about right now are guys on the New York Jets. Aaron Rodgers getting injured in the first drive. The other hugely devastating thing, in addition to J.K. Dobbins, specifically for our portfolios, there are other things going on too that we've tried to reference and do justice to in terms of the sadness and seriousness with things like Nick Chubb and others. That Aaron Rodgers injury in some ways is almost worse. It's not worse, but you could argue that as the season goes along, you're going to do more damage to your team with Garrett Wilson being healthy and Breece Hall being healthy than if they were simply out and you weren't having to make that weekly decision of, do I play a guy who is a superstar, but who has all of these hurdles that they have to overcome every single game and every single play? You mentioned if you're going to kind of do a buy low, like a sell high, buy low with Puka, where you go after like a second round player, maybe even a first round player in Garrett Wilson. Would you trade Puka for Garrett Wilson right now? And then as we go deeper into that, what are we doing with Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall? That's
so funny because you told me you're going to do this on the show. I told you before the show, I hate doing the trade valuations. I don't even make trade offers anymore. We play in so many leagues where you're not allowed to trade. It's such an important part of the home leagues, but it's not something that I spend a lot of time on trade value wise. I think the Puka Garrett thing is, that's just a depressing question, right? It's close. As we go into the Jets thing, before I answer that question, we'll come back to it. The big thing that I wrote about in the Stealing Signals today on the Jets this week, was that I think they will replace Zach Wilson. I wrote, expect him to be replaced by the trade deadline, if not sooner, right? And I think there's a possibility that it is actually sooner and very soon. Then we also heard today, a small report, that Chad Henne said on a podcast or something, that the Jets reached out to him and tried to bring him in after Aaron Rodgers' injury. Chad Henne, longtime backup of Patrick Mahomes over the last several years with the Chiefs, retired after last offseason. And he was just telling the story as, he decided that he was content, that he had walked away from the NFL for the right reasons and he did not need to go back. But it was also very interesting from the context of the Jets have already contacted quarterbacks to potentially bring one in. Henne probably not one to immediately challenge Zach Wilson necessarily. There's a big question, though, about who would they bring in and all of those things. I think when you look at it from the perspective of the Jets and Zach Wilson, it's very similar to me to an argument that I was making last offseason around Ezekiel Elliott, where a lot of people were saying the Cowboys have always ridden Ezekiel Elliott. He's always going to be their guy, etc. One of the things I know I wrote about in like my bold predictions going into last season was that Tony Pollard would outscore him directly. One of the very specific cases I was making about Elliott was that the reason they stuck with him so much in 2021, this was a big point people were making last offseason. They stuck with him last year. But the reason they did in 2021 is they were still locked into him through 2022 from a contract perspective. There's this multi-year thing that happens where from a contract perspective, they had to keep doing it. And then also there's the compound effect of, we did that and it didn't work. And so then in 2022, my prediction was they wouldn't put up with another horrible year of Ezekiel Elliott. They did in some respects, but they didn't in other respects. We did see more Pollard. And then they did walk away from him after the 2022 season. I think the same kind of compound effect exists with Zach Wilson. All of last year, there was calls to bench Zach Wilson late in the year, but their season wasn't going anywhere. And Robert Saleh consistently stood behind Zach Wilson. I don't think he stood behind him because he actually believed in him. I believe they stood behind him because they needed to be 100% certain. It made all the sense in the world with the rest of that wasted season to be 100% certain that their former number 2 overall pick was not the guy. And they found out that he continued to play very poorly, but they did that all through 2022. They pushed it. They kept him out there, and he continued to play poorly. They talked him up as having had a good offseason and being in a good position to be the backup this year and some of those things. But he's had 2 really, really poor games so far. And one of the other things I mentioned in Signals is we've had an interesting dynamic where in both games we've had commentators that are kind of some of the ones that are willing to be the most frank about their opinions. In the first instance, it was on Monday Night Football. We had the Manning brothers, and you had Peyton Manning really just ripping into Zach Wilson's play, like not holding back. And they had Ryan Fitzpatrick on there as well, and Fitzpatrick had some funny jokes and some comments about because he's running 20, 30 yards back, about how he has to throw 40 yards just to get a 5-yard completion because he's so far behind the line of scrimmage. And then last week you had Tony Romo on the call, and he's another guy of all the color guys that is willing to be pretty blunt about things. And he was just basically saying the same thing. Like, you can't play quarterback like this at the NFL level. The Jets do get the win in week 1 against the Bills, obviously. They get completely run out of the arena against the Cowboys. They have a tough upcoming schedule. They face the Chiefs in week 4. They face the Eagles in week 6, and then they're on a week 7 bye. They also have the Patriots and the Broncos in weeks 3 and 5. There's a real possibility they're 1-5 going into that bye. That actually might complicate things because I do think this roster is good enough to win if they can find a quarterback. But you look ahead a couple of weeks. If they lose to the Patriots this week especially, and you have the Chiefs behind that, whether Zach Wilson plays against the Chiefs in week 4 or not, I don't think you're expecting them to beat the Chiefs. And so, especially if they lose to the Patriots, you're looking at, okay, well, they might be 1-3 through 4 games. And their season's on the line at that point. I mean, but especially if they're able to win the Patriots, especially as you look forward to the bye week, You think about whether they could make a trade for a backup quarterback somewhere else and then give him some time to integrate. That week 7 bye week is obviously something to circle. And so circling all the way back to the value on Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall. My point on Zach Wilson is he is disqualifyingly bad for an NFL team, but also is so bad as to just really, really be damaging to the potential of the skill players. And the way I would describe it is I think he's like a 5th percentile type of quarterback play. You're not going to find a 50th percentile player quarterback for cheap and be able to just bring him in. That's not how it works. But I do think you can find like a 25th percentile, like a guy who's bad and well below average, but is still competent. I think Joe Flacco was in this Jets offense last year, a 25th percentile type player. Mike White probably was too. He ends up in Miami this offseason. You're probably not getting him back. They were looking to upgrade their backup situation with Tua's concussion issues. But you do have, maybe a Joe Flacco is willing to come back. I don't know. But I think the answers are not exciting, but they're not 5th percentile bad. And honestly, 5th percentile might be giving Zach Wilson a little bit too much credit. And the reason I bring up Manning and I bring up Romo and those things is this is not just my opinion, but it's strongly my opinion too when I've watched Zach Wilson. But it's every observer who watches him says that he plays the quarterback position right now, and maybe he can develop later in his career, but he plays so poorly as to make a functional offense not possible. And that's a major issue. I mean, he does show flashes. He made some nice throws. He had a really nice throw to Allen Lazard on the sideline at one point. He hits Garrett Wilson in stride on the slant that Garrett Wilson wins on, and Wilson takes it to the house. They get a 68-yard touchdown on that. But they had 212 yards, I think it was, of offense, and 68 of them came on that one play. The rest of the game, they had 140. Now, they are playing a really tough Dallas defense in this game, but if you're not even able to move the football with the talent that they have, you can't play quarterback for a long time. And again, going back to the Ezekiel Elliott example, going back to some of the other examples, you can say like they're both running backs, but Clyde Edwards-Helaire going into last season, eventually the Chiefs gave up. Najee Harris going into this year, everyone was saying his workload is always going to be really, really strong because it always has been. And Mike Tomlin only uses workhorses. We've seen that change in year 3 of Najee Harris's career where they're like, he's just not good enough. Like we have to use the things that are actually working, and Jaylen Warren is going to play more because that's actually better for our offense. Teams over multiple years will change the way that they stick with guys. And I always get this feedback that like, well, they've stuck with him in the past. And it's like, well, that compounds when they stick with him and he fails. And Zach Wilson, I know it's only week 3, but he's at the end of his leash because of 2022 and because of 2021. There's no way in my mind that they stick with Zach Wilson through all of 2023, which then will ideally, if they can get from 5th percentile to 25th percentile quarterback play, will make it so that a guy like a Garrett Wilson can elevate his surroundings. It's not so disqualifying. But right now it is like, I mean, if you don't get a 68-yard touchdown or Breece Hall gets the 80-yard run in week 1, you're not going to get any production otherwise. Garrett Wilson in week 1 also makes a ridiculous catch at the goal line on a really poorly thrown fade route, but he makes it work and he scores a touchdown. So then he has a 30-yard and 1 touchdown game. I understand that he's had the production through the 2 games, and so there might actually be a little bit of trade value with Garrett Wilson, but I think you have to sell probably low on what his actual potential is. We talked about it, Sean, as soon as Aaron Rodgers went down, what he can be changed. What the bet was changed. He can't be what we thought his ceiling could be with Aaron Rodgers. But I do think once Zach Wilson's out of there, I see post-bye positive outcomes for Garrett Wilson that are strong. Now, again, all the way back to the Puka Nacua question, see a lot of positive outcomes for Puka Nacua as well. And I'm probably taking Puka Nacua.
I agree with everything you said there.
Good, because I talked for like 10 minutes.
You got to get those soliloquies in from time to time. I agree with everything you said, and yet I may still be more concerned than you are. And I don't like to be the voice of reason or the voice of
pessimism.
Yeah.
You're the optimist in our partnership.
Yeah. One of the things that I know, because I wrote about it a lot this offseason as it related to our thesis for Garrett Wilson and why we were definitely taking him early in the second round while we were taking him at the 1-2 turn, while we continued to take him as he rose into the, as early as 108, 109, that range in there, is that there were 3 different quarterbacks for the Jets last season. And actually a pretty huge chunk of the passing plays, or the passing attempts, didn't come from Wilson, right? He had 242, Flacco had 191, Mike White had 175. And as impossible as this is to believe, Wilson had averaged the most yards per attempt of that trio. Wilson did. You go to adjusted yards per attempt and add in some of those other terrible plays that Wilson had, and he still was the highest of the 3. You go to net yards per attempt, and you finally get one where he does drop below Mike White because he also took a bunch of sacks at a really high sack rate. Now, I mean, Joe Flacco's numbers last year with them were pretty catastrophic. I think that a little bit of that is fluky. I would certainly far prefer Joe Flacco to be the QB. I think he's a lot better than Zach Wilson. I mean, the numbers from last year in some ways overstate how good/bad he was. It makes it look not as bad as it actually was, right?
Well, but one of the huge elements here is volume, right? Mike White and Joe Flacco they both had 4 starts. Zach Wilson had 9, and you just mentioned 175, 191 attempts for White and Flacco, 242 for Wilson in 9 games.
Right.
The Jets weren't willing to call passes. He only threw like 21 passes a game or something like that, right?
Exactly. So you're going to get more aggressiveness almost with anybody else. And that's for fantasy, that's hugely important. My concern would simply be that at this point, it actually is going to be extremely difficult for them to find anybody who can play a competent quarterback. And you think about the Arizona Cardinals, who traded for Dobbs before the season. And Dobbs actually looked fantastic in the first half of week 2. So you do get these little stretches where someone who's very clearly not a starting caliber NFL quarterback can go in and do some things that are dynamic and fun and allow you to score some points. Now, one of the big problems that we've had is that, bizarrely, other than like barely Zach Ertz, still none of those receivers are playable. And, Marquise Brown is a pretty good player, not a star to Garrett Wilson's level by any stretch, but a pretty good player. Once the injury happened, the next day, sort of seriously and sort of just, trying to work through the grief, Connor and I made a list of all of these quarterbacks that we wanted them to consider. And the lack of options, I think, becomes pretty stark when you think about us, like 99% jokingly, but like 1% seriously, at least for me, like guys like Kurt Warner. I mean, people who were in their 50s, right, who could barely throw the ball across the line of scrimmage when they retired. But I'm just like, Peyton Manning couldn't throw the ball across the line of scrimmage in his final year. Kurt Warner couldn't throw the ball across the line of scrimmage. Phillip Rivers, hasn't been able to throw the ball across the line of scrimmage for a long time. Still much more effective quarterbacks. It's like, if you already couldn't throw the ball, like how much worse would you have gotten if you're in your 50s? Maybe Phillip Rivers would be somebody. He's mentioned in the past that he actually wanted to come back and play just the down the stretch part. The other issue that I have with this, though, is exactly what you mentioned, which is that they can get buried from this playoff race so early that it stops making the same kind of sense to continue to go after it. Now, we do have these cases, and one of them we saw last year with the Detroit Lions, where, they were probably, another week or 2 away from their coach getting dismissed, or at least when you're starting to really go out and make those proclamations that you're behind your coaching staff. You're getting to that point, and then they come roaring back, and they don't quite make it, but now they look very good. The Jets could be in that same situation, but how do you come roaring back in the AFC East that has those other 3 teams, right? Again, maybe it's possible. One of the things that, pops to my mind is that despite all the salary cap ramifications, of which there are plenty, you can go, pull that up and Spot Track or Over the Cap. You'll be able to see some different things. There may even be nuances. I'm sure there are nuances that I don't understand to it that are also massive hurdles. But when you consider where the Cardinals are going and the fact that they seem to be setting themselves up for Caleb Williams, if Kyler Murray is in a situation where he's going to be healthy, but the Cardinals definitely don't want to play him for a variety of reasons. I mean, maybe Kyler Murray would be a healthy option for the Jets down the line. The problem with that, and one of the problems that keeps coming up, is that Aaron Rodgers is still a problem because Aaron Rodgers wants to play for this team next year. His coaches are there. All of his teammates are there. This whole Jets situation doesn't work because when you married yourself to Aaron Rodgers, you married yourself to all of the rest of the stuff too. And so, I mean, one of the more obvious things would be to try and go out and get a Gardner Minshew. But, I mean, he's currently a pretty important piece of another team that is probably tanking, and so he will probably be available. And yet, I guess, I mean, I expect something to get done, but the path that the Jets have to a quarterback who actually makes Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall playable does seem very difficult to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is pessimistic. And so you're saying that people should be willing to sell high a little bit. I do think the value has shifted substantially. You're talking about a lot of the old guys, and that was where my mind went initially. But as I've thought through it more, I think what I would be potentially maybe even more interested in is going to the young guys, trying to find the next Brock Purdy or whatever. I mean, I don't know who that would be, and that's obviously an issue, but you could cycle through multiple of them. We could go to, Fantasy Douche's YOLO QB strategy and start trying to do a lot of different things. Jake Haener was one that was interesting. He got suspended 6 games for PED use. Stetson Bennett was a guy that people were talking about, but he got mysteriously placed on the non-football injury list, and there hasn't been a lot of reporting around that. Some of the guys that the teams have liked since the preseason, like Aiden O'Connell or Dorian Thompson-Robinson, are not going to be available. These are all guys that got drafted in day 3, quarterbacks from this class. But there are probably some guys even later. I don't know a ton about a lot of the later guys, or even potentially undrafted. Yeah, it's insane to think that you would bring in an undrafted rookie and ask him to try to figure out an NFL playbook without having had a training camp and play any better than Zach Wilson. Although playing better than Zach Wilson is a very low bar. But like the XFL, the USFL, I didn't watch those leagues as much this year. Are there not guys that played in those leagues that are again, I'm not asking for average quarterback play. I'm not asking. Kyler Murray has the potential to be a lot better than what I'm actually even asking for. I'm asking for Mike White level play, where it's okay, we can at least run a functional, fast-paced offense. We don't have to try to hide our quarterback every snap. And then also every time we drop back to pass, we wished we would have just hit him. And we're literally going to try to win a game without ever dropping back. It's 1965, that's unfortunately where we're at with what they have to do with Zach Wilson. Having said that, I can't really disagree with any of your points either. There's not obvious answers. You talk about the Gardner Minshew. There's not a lot of he's probably going to start this week for the Colts. So it's not like he's readily available necessarily. They're in a bad division. They might want to win with a new coaching staff. They might think Gardner Minshew is a really important part of what they're doing. That coaching staff came over from Philly and brought Minshew over from Philly. Maybe Jameis Winston is available, but probably not. But that's where Jake Haener is in New Orleans, and they also have Taysom Hill now listed as a quarterback, and so they're in a situation where once Haener comes back, if they do like him, they're going to have 4 different quarterbacks. Jameis Winston was one that I've seen floated and will at least throw the ball, right? Stand back there and release the ball on time as opposed to running 30 yards backwards. And, people have described Zach Wilson as sort of bizarro Patrick Mahomes. I mean, it's Patrick Mahomes, but if he sucked, I think is the way maybe that you described him last year. But you're right. There's not a lot of good answers is the unfortunate part.
Well, I mean, one of the problems that I have with Jameis Winston, this was the best suggestion that Connor had as well, and I would love it. The part of it that is tricky is that for Jameis Winston to be worth anything, you have to actually let him throw the ball. And that's where he makes a lot of mistakes. And I don't know if that fits what the Jets want. But in a best case scenario, he would go out there and would
he doesn't make any sense for the Jets. He only makes sense for fantasy managers, but
exactly.
Let us have
we can still dream. But go out there, let him be the Jameis Winston that he was when he made Mike Evans and Chris Godwin the fantasy superstars, and still was bad enough that Bruce Arians was like, enough of that. But do that at the same time the Jets are playing fantastic defense. Makes them a fun team.
The Falcons brought in Taylor Heineke this offseason. They also have Logan Woodside, who was one of those XFL graduates. I think it was XFL for him, and played vaguely okay there, and then was with the Titans and is now with the Falcons. They have 3 quarterbacks. I'm just like literally like looking around at teams that have 3 quarterbacks, and I'm like, well, they could spare a backup quarterback, couldn't they? That's what I'm telling myself.
Yeah, for these quarterbacks or these teams where, the Aaron Rodgers injury illustrates so clearly what the downside is if you don't have someone else.
Yeah.
It all depends on how much the Jets would be willing to pay, because if you will actually pony up a big pick to make the move because you think you're there, then, they could definitely pry Jacoby Brissett loose. Right. And he was much better than Deshaun Watson last year. Might be the best backup in the NFL. That's one of the reasons that people were scared of Sam Howell. Howell looks really good. Jacoby Brissett is almost certainly not going to get in for the Commanders this season now based on performance. But also, Howell's already taken a bunch of hits. He could easily get in there due to injury. And if the Commanders coaching staff feels like they have to make the playoffs or at least look good to keep their jobs, then they're going to be pretty loath to give up a really good backup again, unless the Jets are willing to overpay. So we get a little bit of a sense of just how much urgency the Jets feel based on what they do in the next couple of weeks.
And I would argue that's sort of the point I was trying to make with the Zach Wilson thing is I would argue they probably feel some pressure to win. They had that offseason with high expectations. They had Aaron Rodgers, obviously, as the centerpiece of all of that. They had Hard Knocks. They had all of that. And they have a lot of talent, and you have narrow windows in the NFL, obviously. There's also been some talk. Aaron Rodgers has said that maybe he could return by the playoffs. We've actually seen Cam Akers do that, and some of these guys do that. Or not some of these guys. I guess Akers is really the only example, but he came back in 6 months. Rodgers' window is even narrower because Akers got hurt in like June and was able to come back by January. But also, Rodgers doesn't necessarily have to move around a ton. So if the Jets were able to get there, maybe he would play in January. And so part of their consideration could be, can we just sneak into a wild card spot and then see if Rodgers can play in early January? That seems unlikely. I'm talking about the 3 quarterback situations or some of the teams that are carrying 3. Obviously, we have the rule change this year where the teams can have an inactive emergency quarterback as their number 3 quarterback. So some of these teams who have 3 quarterbacks, to your point, they're doing it because that's the rules now set them up to carry 3 quarterbacks. They want to carry 3 quarterbacks. They might not want to trade Logan Woodside as their 3rd quarterback or whatever it was I was saying. Not that Logan Woodside would be guaranteed to be a better play than Zach Wilson. I look at the Commanders. They have Jake Fromm on their practice squad. I assume they're like elevating him / making him their inactive 3rd QB. Some of these teams that only have 2 quarterbacks, I assume, are elevating a practice squad guy every week. I don't know for sure how the game day stuff is actually happening in all these instances. Some of the teams are still only carrying 2 quarterbacks despite the rule change. So I don't know if it's, like I said, being elevated for game day off the practice squad or what have you. But that might make a trade more difficult. To your point, what happens if you lose your starter? You're trying to win. You want to have quarterback depth. We saw it with the Niners last year as well. 3 different quarterback injuries by the time they're in the NFC Championship. This is why the rule got changed. Actually, 4 different quarterback injuries. They end up playing Josh Johnson in that NFC Championship game after Purdy hurts his elbow, and then Johnson gets the concussion. And obviously those 2 were the active quarterbacks because of prior injuries to Trey Lance and Jimmy Garoppolo. You just see how quickly, for a team like the Jets, who's trying to win and hope they can get into the playoffs and be moving through the playoffs on the strength of a great defense and everything else. If you have multiple quarterback injuries, you see how quickly you can wind up in a situation where you're I mean, the Niners just did this. They're playing a guy with a torn UCL, and they don't have anyone else to put out there. And that's, again, why they changed the rule. But so high profile that a lot of these teams might not be willing to just give up a backup. Like you said, how much are the Jets going to be willing to pay? I'm hoping they're motivated in terms of basically saying anything but Zach Wilson. The other tricky part for them in terms of their motivation, you bring up like a Kyler Murray, is that Aaron Rodgers is going to be back next year, or he wants to be back, or they have to be thinking we need to have Aaron Rodgers available to start in 2024. So if they go get like a Kyler Murray, then what happens in 2024? And so that's a complication. Whoever they get is basically a 1-year Band-Aid. Brings you back to Phillip Rivers.
In 2015 and 2016, Ryan Fitzpatrick played for the New York Jets. And in that 2016 season, he was 34 years old, threw 12 touchdowns, 17 interceptions. But if he's out there making fun of Zach Wilson, I say get him on the field. Let's see what he can do. Ryan Fitzpatrick is still my favorite. In his 40s.
Easily, yeah.
Let's see what he can do.
He's easily the best option. He didn't play all of last year. He was the week 1 starter in 2021 for Washington. Obviously got that hip injury, broke his hip or whatever, and said, if I'm breaking my hip, I'm obviously too old to play. If he came back in 2023, I'd lose it. He would be so great for Garrett Wilson. So you're saying it's dire, Sean. We have to trade Garrett Wilson. We have to bench Breece Hall. We have to cry in the shower.
But again, the point that I would just finish with, on the positive note, these guys had horrible quarterback play last year, and they were both very exciting players. I do think that they're still going to be playable. They're just not playable at nearly the level that we might have gotten, which was both of them being top 5 sorts of guys. So that'll do it for today's Stealing Bananas. Always just so much fun to get together with Ben. If you haven't checked out Stealing Signals, make sure you do that. He and I were chatting about some of his intros today. Those also, I mean, people tend to think of all the stats in there. The intros will change how you think about fantasy football. Make sure you get signed up over there. Also a Stealing Lines project with Dalton Cates. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. Young writers or very interesting writers like Matt Spencer and Jake Bose both put out some really cool analytics on DFS and Best Ball this week. You don't want to miss that. You also don't want to pay full price. Discount code is RVRadio2023 at checkout. Get 10% off your 1-year subscription. Leave us a rating and review. Those help us with the algorithm. We love you guys. Good luck in week 2. We'll talk to you soon.